A very good afternoon to everyone. I hope you can all hear and see me well enough. Thank you for joining us on Transgenerational Trauma Awareness Day. My name is David Babington and I'm Chief Executive of Action Mental Health, and we're the lead partner on the Our Generation project, which is supported by the EU's Peace 4 programme managed by SEUPB, the special EU programmes body, and is match funded by the Irish government and the Executive Office. Firstly, a huge thank you to you all for putting aside time during what is an extremely busy time of year to join us for today's TTAD talk webinar. You're very welcome for what I'm sure is going to be an interesting and insightful event. We're delighted that TTAD has returned, and this is the second event after its inaugural launch last year, which was a huge success, and we hope that it will become a regular feature in our calendar. Firstly, some housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded and will be available to view on the Our Generation website in coming days. Access for all of you is limited, so don't worry, your cameras and microphones aren't supposed to be working, so don't panic. Use the Q&A button for any questions. Tech support is also available at webinar@plan.co.uk, as you can see there on the slide. And if you're tweeting on social media today, please use hashtag TTAD22 and hashtag Breaking the Cycle and our tag at RGenCYP there on the slide. The theme of today is breaking the cycle, and that's what we want to achieve with this very important Awareness Day. The legacy of the Troubles, as we know, is still impacting individuals and communities here in Northern Ireland, and we've entered a period of economic and political instability in the aftermath of COVID, and of course the cost of living crisis continues to affect many people. All these factors have an adverse effect on mental health and can contribute to transgenerational trauma. So we want to raise awareness of transgenerational trauma here in Northern Ireland and the border regions of Ireland, but we also want TTAD to be a small step to helping break the cycle of transgenerational trauma in other places too. Unfortunately, as you know, we live in a world where a legacy of conflict exists in many countries, as well as additional issues such as sectarianism, racism, genocide, and extreme poverty. Transgenerational trauma is a key issue on this island that has an impact on our children and young people, as the legacy of conflict is recycled and lives on in the next generations. So we want to expand that conversation to all areas of our society so that we can help our children and young people break the cycle and grow up better together. We want to expand the conversation beyond the island, and that is why today you'll hear about approaches to trauma-informed practice from a local perspective, as well as from an education perspective in Scotland. There'll be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the event, and if you'd like to ask a question, please leave this in the chat provided, and we'll try and get through as many as we can at the end. In a moment, I'm going to hand you over to Professor Siobhan O'Neill, Mental Health Champion for Northern Ireland, who will give you a short introduction. I think to many of you who are attending today, she will need no introductions. But just to remind you, Siobhan is a Professor of Mental Health Sciences at Ulster University and Mental Health Champion for Northern Ireland since 2020. And her research programmes focus on trauma, mental illness and suicidal behaviour in Northern Ireland and the transgenerational transmission of trauma. And she's on a mission to improve the mental health of people of Northern Ireland by promoting evidence-based services and care for those who suffer from mental illness and suicidal thoughts. But also in her unique role as Mental Health Champion for Northern Ireland, she advises and assists in the promotion of mental health and well-being through all policies and services throughout the province. And her role really there is as a public advocate for mental health and to be a voice for those otherwise voiceless. And her goal is to communicate the collective concerns of people with lived experience and their families and carers, and to advocate for communities impacted by mental health inequalities. Siobhan, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much, David, and thanks everybody for joining us today on Transgenerational Trauma Awareness Day. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes now to set the scene around transgenerational trauma in Northern Ireland and where it comes from, what it is that we're talking about. And then we're going to hear from some amazing speakers who will tell us what we need to be doing in more detail to address the impact of transgenerational trauma here. So I'm going to share my screen now and hopefully this will work. There we go. Now you should see that. And I need to switch it over here. So as David said, I'm a mental health champion for Northern Ireland, but before taking up that role, that it's a secondment from my post as a university professor, I studied the link between mental health in Northern Ireland and our history of conflict and our history of trauma, and worked on a number of studies where we analysed trauma and suicidal behaviour and mental health here. So the stuff I'm talking about has arisen from that research, but I'm going to start with some more recent research that I wasn't involved in, but I'm using this a lot. So I'm using other people's research here. This is Lisa Bunting and colleagues who conducted the Youth Wellbeing Prevalence Survey in 2019. Now, this was published in 2020, but the data is from before the pandemic, and it provides us one of the best and most accurate pictures of the mental health of our young people in Northern Ireland here. As it stands now, we know that this would have got a bit worse as a result of the pandemic, so even these figures are maybe a bit lower than they would be right now. But this study found that 1 in 8 young people here had a mood or anxiety disorder. So that's a clinically diagnosable mental health disorder, so a mental illness, if you like. And some of them would have been mild mental illness, but 1 in 8 is really very, very high. 1 in 6 of our young people were engaging in patterns of disordered eating. Very worrying because, of course, eating disorders and suicidal behaviour carry the highest risk of death of any of the mental health problems. So 1 in 6 disordered eating, not full eating disorders, but patterns of eating that can certainly lead to eating disorders. 1 in 10 had engaged in self-harm behaviours, which is a risk factor for suicide, and not necessarily a mental illness, a way of coping with stress and pressure. But nonetheless, really worrying and really, really harmful there. And 1 in 8 had thought about or attempted suicide. So again, very, very concerning figures. And in our adult population, the most recent statistics tell us that around 1 in 5 adults have a probable mental illness. Again, that is too high. A lot of these mental health problems can be prevented. And the cost of mental illness in Northern Ireland is 3.4 billion annually. So that's absolutely huge. That's half our health budget. So the mental illness is very prevalent here. It's impacting on not only people's lives through the suffering, but it's also got that economic impact. So what is the role of transgenerational trauma in this whole picture then? So let us look at what mental health is. And because if we look at mental health, we can see where transgenerational trauma can be located. So mental health is biological. It's about how our bodies and brains respond to stress and our ability to cope with stress and pressure and the emotions and feelings that come with that. So it is biological in that it's about our physical response to stress. It's also psychological because it's about how we think and feel. And of course, stress and pressure result in changes to how we think and feel. And it's those changes to thoughts, feelings and behaviours that really are what constitute mental illness. So thinking and feeling is part of this as well. And then the final bit of it is relational. It's about our relationships with other people, how we fit into the society that we live in, and how we fit into our families, communities, and that social context. We're very much pack animals. We need the presence of our families and communities to help us feel stable and psychologically safe so that we can be our best selves. And poor mental health happens when we feel isolated, when we feel disconnected, when even loneliness can be associated with a higher risk of mental illness there as well. So those 3 components are in fact really, really important to mental health. And they're also important in terms of the transgenerational transmission of trauma, because trauma is transmitted from one generation to the next through all of these mechanisms. But it's how they operate in families. So the biological is there, the psychological, the patterns of thoughts and feelings, we inherit those, we mimic those, we model those based on what we see in our parents and our communities. And then our relationships are so important there as well. So all 3 of those levels are affected in the transgenerational transmission of trauma. When I started doing this work, most of the emphasis really was on the transmission of trauma through childhood adversities. So this is the idea that when a parent has a mental health problem, when they have a mental illness, the symptoms of that illness changes how they behave and impacts on their attachment patterns, on their ability to really connect with their wee ones, with their kids. And we know that people with hypervigilance, that comes with trauma exposure. You know, that flashbacks, nightmares change our stress response settings to make us hypervigilant, and that can happen. And of course, hypervigilance in a family can manifest as you know, violent, aggressive behavior, snapping, unpredictability, all of that stuff is associated with trauma exposure, and it does impact that child. So what I'm saying here really is that parental mental illness is considered a childhood adversity, and childhood adversities are the biggest risk factor for mental health problems. Now, this is not inevitable. There's lots of evidence saying that when a child has one adult that can really connect and meet their needs, then, you know, that's really all they need. And none of us are perfect parents, but there is that body of evidence showing that particularly maternal depression and poor mental health and trauma-related mental illness, which can be more associated with hypervigilance and reactivity, that can be particularly damaging to that relationship. And that relationship is fundamental to good mental health. So attachment, good attachment in those first few years of life when the brain's developing, that's associated with the child's ability to regulate their emotional response, to calm themselves down when the stress hits them. And that's fundamental to good mental health. It's also associated with mindedness, so the capacity of the child to read others' emotions, and even empathy and mentalization, so the ability to see other people's perspectives. And my goodness, that's so important when we're trying to build peace, when we're trying to negotiate solutions to really tricky problems that we have here, when we have divisions. Attachment, mindedness is all really, really important. And unfortunately, parental mental illness and trauma-related mental illness can get in the way of that. So this is all about stress activation and emotional regulation. And poor attachment, there's lots of evidence showing that it's linked to poor emotional regulation. So poor self-awareness, impaired difficulties calming yourself down, social difficulties, and even prejudice. And then, of course, there's that thing where kids mirror and mimic your state. If you're in a bad way, your child just picks up on that so quickly, because they're designed to work in tangent and in tandem with their parents, with their caregivers. So if a parent's hypervigilant, and in order for the child to survive, it's good for them to be hypervigilant too. So this is genetic and it's passed on, but unfortunately it doesn't serve the wee kids well. But transgenerational trauma is about more than just childhood adversities and parental mental illness. There's that epigenetic impact as well. There's that biological impact of being exposed to trauma. So when a parent has that trauma exposure, it changes chemicals in the surface of the genes. It switches part of those genes on and off, and they're genes that are responsible for things like inflammatory responses, emotional regulation, all of those things. Now, the good thing is that it's epigenetic, it's not genetic. So epi means on the surface. So epidemiology is a population level. So epi is the surface. And it can, you know, if you can switch something on, you can switch it off again as well. And this means that it is malleable, that it can be reversed, it can be changed. But that epigenetic impact does seem to be there. And particularly the studies of animal models show how when a parent is exposed to a lot of stress and pressure, that does influence how they then respond to stress and pressure. And that little shift is passed on to the next generation. And it impacts on their stress response as well, and their risk of mental illness or poor mental health. There's also some really interesting evidence from the 9/11, the mothers who were pregnant at the time of the Twin Towers, and they're now able to track the impact of that trauma exposure in the womb in utero. So that event and that trauma and what happened when the wee child's brain, as it was developing, was flooded with cortisol, with the chemicals that were released when the mother had that trauma exposure. And we now see that depending on the trimester of the pregnancy, that those chemicals again change how that brain develops. It's all about helping that brain adapt to the world that child's going to live in. It's adaptive. The idea is it's designed to help the child survive. But unfortunately, then it can impact on brain development and stress response in a way that can create a child who's hypervigilant and less well able to soothe themselves and stay calm. And the other impacts that we need to remember are the things like the family narratives. And we see this in families where there's been a traumatic event, an atrocity, and the families are either fighting for justice and very vocal about it, and it becomes really central to the story of that family, or the family shuts down and remains silent. And both of those things are adaptive in their own way and can have really positive impacts, but they also can carry negative impacts and can influence the child's risk of mental health problems depending on how that's experienced in a family. We also have whole communities who remain impacted by the trauma of the Troubles, who continue to live in fear of what has happened in the past and are worried about the future for that reason. And then we have the legacy of poverty. Again, the cost of living crisis. We know that people who live in those areas that were most affected by the Troubles, by the conflict, are the same communities who are being hit really hard. And that 1 in 4 children here live in poverty. And that is very much an impact of transgenerational trauma as well. That poverty has been as a consequence of the impact of the Troubles in their communities. And of course, we're going through very difficult times at the minute in terms of truth and justice and working all of that out. And that can resurrect old traumas and change how people remember things and change how people make meaning from events that have happened, again, in a way that impacts on the mental health of the children and young people in those families too. So one of the things I like to say when I'm talking about transgenerational trauma now is that it's not maybe just a scarring, a negative effect. There are positives to this. It is adaptive. It's always about trying to create a person or a being that can survive. And there's some positive things that have been passed on as well. And we maybe do have a generation now who are more self-aware, who are more attuned to injustice. Yes, there's maybe a higher risk of mental illness, but there may well come a resilience as a result of the exposures and a positive social impact there that can be good as well. So when we're talking about transgenerational trauma, we need to think about it as an adaptive thing that can carry negative impacts, but also it could be transgenerational resilience, because that's the idea of adaptation, of evolution. That's how it works. So what do we need in Northern Ireland? Well, we need to be trauma and ACEs informed. We need to recognise the impact of our history on the young people particularly, but the whole population now, because everybody's affected by this. So we need to be informed about that, and we need to practice in a way that recognises trauma. And we're going to hear a bit more about what that might look like in a minute. We need to teach young people about metacognition, about how to work the most important part of their body, which is their brain, about how to manage their stress response and how to become more self-aware. And we do need to treat mental illness and suicidal behaviour there so that we can address this and not pass it on to a future generation. My final point is that mental ill health costs 3.4 billion annually just to get that. So, and much of this can be prevented. And this is from a Mental Health Foundation report, McDaden Park, just at the start of the year. Very important report showing the huge cost of mental illness here. That's half our health budget. And we know that much of this can be prevented or reduced. And they actually set out good buys, good investments with solid evidence that will reduce the impact of mental illness and the economic impact of mental illness at a very cost-effective price. So we have things like health visitor delivered interventions and those early stages, parenting programs, workplace programs, all of those interventions that help people at the early stages and deliver brief psychological interventions to people at risk. So this stuff can be prevented, it can be addressed, and trauma-informed practice is a big part of that as well. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak again this year. So it's lovely to be here. And I'm now going to pass you back to David, who's going to introduce our other expert speakers today. Thank you.
Siobhan, thanks so much, and I appreciate, particularly this time of year, you've got a frantic schedule, so thank you so much for fitting us in. But I think that's really helpful scene setting around all the issues for our next speakers. And that then leads me on to our next speakers, and particularly our first speaker. And I'm delighted to introduce Deirdre McLaughlin. Deirdre established Connected for Life with her colleague Marie Blaney in 2016. Deirdre is a psychology graduate, social worker, and systemic practitioner with many years of experience in a range of settings, including youth justice in both practice and management roles. And she's also a part-time lecturer in social work and health and social care at Belfast Metropolitan College. So she's clearly kept very busy. Connected for Life aims to raise awareness of the far-reaching impact of trauma and adversity on individuals, families, organisations and communities, and to support those impacted. They do so through providing a range of services to individuals and families, professionals, organisations and communities by presentations, training and consultation, as well as developing and delivering a range of interventions. So for TTAD 22, Deirdre will present the story of Peter and Paul, which has recently been adapted and included as a contribution to Dr. Karen Treisman's book, A Treasure Box for Creating Trauma-Informed Organisations. And it shares the stories of two young men who both experienced childhood adversity and trauma, but their lives took different trajectories. And the story is based on Deirdre and Marie's experiences of working for decades in the justice system and seeing intergenerational patterns of violence and offending attachment, adversity and trauma. You're very welcome, Deirdre.
Thank you very much, David. Sorry, don't have my wee speaker thing down. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. If everyone, just while I'm sharing my screen, I know personally when I'm listening to webinars, I get a bit kind of, so people want to, nobody can see you. If you want to stand up and have a wee stretch just while I'm sharing my screen, that would be great. Just okay, hopefully people can see that okay. Yep, no issues.
All good. Thanks, Deirdre.
Oh, good. Okay, let's get started then. Okay. So now what am I doing? Back to my first slide. So as we've just I've just been introduced there, so I was going to introduce myself, but as you've heard, I'm one half, and I'll not say certainly not the better half. My colleague Mary's not with me today, but I'm one half of Connected for Life. And as you heard, we provide training and consultation for organisations, and we work with young people, parents, families and communities. Now, for decades, we worked in a justice context with young people and families. And like those of you listening, I'm sure we saw transgenerational and intergenerational patterns, not only patterns of offending, but patterns of trauma and attachment as well. So we just thinking about what that cycle looked like, okay? We think it looked a bit like this. So just move my wee thing so I can see the screen here. Now, just doing a wee bit of jiggling about so that I can see properly here. Yeah. So we have an adult who has unprocessed trauma, and as Siobhan outlined really well, they're insecure attachment patterns. So that adult has a child, and because of what's gone before, that adult-child relationship very often is under stress. And in turn, that child can then experience trauma and develop an insecure attachment. And because the child is developing in a stressful environment, their physical, emotional, cognitive, their overall development can be impacted. And that child can then struggle with self-regulation. And we know that this shows up in their behaviour. And I suppose in a justice context, a youth justice context, we saw this most often in offending behaviour, in anger, aggression, impulsive behaviour, and very often self-soothing using alcohol and drugs. Now, of course, that child doesn't stay a child forever. The child grows up and becomes an adult and usually meets a partner. Now, because of how attachment and trauma work, very often this partner has also experienced trauma, and very often they also have an insecure attachment style, which can put that adult relationship under stress. Then they go on to have a child of their own, and all too often the cycle continues. So, however, sometimes something different happens. Sometimes we meet someone who, despite experiencing a huge amount of trauma, is able to break the cycle. Some of us, if we're honest, have our own experiences of trauma, and some of us have broken the cycle, or maybe we're trying to break the cycle. So what is the magic ingredient that helps us to break the cycle? As David explained, to answer the question from our perspective, I'm going to share a story that we wrote for the Action Trauma Conference in 2019. And this story is based on some of the experiences of many of the young people that we've worked with over the years. And it's called The Story of Peter and Paul. So it's going to start like this. Here we have two little boys sitting on the wall, one called Peter and the other called Paul. Peter had trauma, so had Paul. But what saved Peter and what failed Paul? So let's find out. First of all, we're going to hear Paul's story, looking at that cycle that I shared a few minutes ago. So Paul's mum was called Amanda, and Amanda grew up in Belfast in the middle of the Troubles. Amanda's family lived in poverty. Her dad had an alcohol dependency, and he was physically abusive to Amanda and her mum and her siblings. Her mum lived with depression and anxiety, and from a young age, Amanda stayed off school to look after her wee brothers and sisters. So when Amanda was 16, she met Mark, and shortly into the relationship, Amanda found out that she was pregnant. And when she told her parents that she was pregnant, they threw her out of the family home, and she moved in with Mark. But it didn't take her long before she realised that Mark had a drug problem, and he was also dealing drugs. And very shortly, Mark was asked to leave that community, and he moved to England, and Amanda never saw him again. So when Paul was born, Amanda was under a lot of stress. At that stage, she was homeless, she was living in a hostel, and she was relying on benefits to survive. She and Paul, they got a wee flat, but Amanda really hated living there because it was an area that was really run down. There was a lot of crime and violence, and there was very few resources in that community. And Amanda, she was very isolated. She had no friends, and she was at that stage estranged from her family. So things were tough. Now, if you asked Amanda what Paul was like, she would say he was a difficult baby because Paul had a highly sensitive temperament. And this meant that not only was he emotionally sensitive, but he also experienced the environment around him much more intensely than children that wouldn't be highly sensitive. And that meant that he cried a lot, and he didn't sleep well because the flats they lived in, you could hear the noise from the neighbours next door, and Paul woke at the slightest noise. And Amanda was already struggling with her mental health, but this deteriorated because of the situation. And she started drinking, self-soothing through alcohol. And after a while, she started leaving Paul in the flat alone to go drinking. So Paul was a baby at this stage, and we know that babies' brains and bodies are developing really rapidly. And we know that children develop in the context of what's going on around them, in the context of their environment. And realistically, the environment that Paul was growing up in was marinated in stress. So understandably, this stress had an impact on Paul's physical, emotional, cognitive, overall development. So Paul moved to a foster family, unfortunately, when he was 18 months old. And in total, Paul lived in 5 foster homes. He usually moved every couple of years because of his emotional outbursts and his aggression towards his foster carers. He did see his mum, he had supervised contact, but sometimes she didn't turn up, or sometimes she turned up under the influence of alcohol. Now, every time he moved, Paul changed schools because he moved into a different area, but usually he was excluded from school very quickly. And he did go to some community activities like sports clubs and youth clubs, but again, he tended to lose his place in these within a short period of time because of his behaviour. When Paul was 13, his mum Amanda died, and he then started to spend a lot more time hanging about the streets and started to get involved in antisocial behaviour. And word soon spread in the community, as you can imagine, about the things that he had done. And soon any crime or any antisocial behaviour that happened in that community was blamed on him, sometimes for justifiable reasons and other times not. Now, when he was 14, Paul was physically assaulted by members of a so-called paramilitary organisation in the community, and at that stage he was moved to a children's home. He had started drinking heavily at this stage and he was using cannabis. And soon he was arrested for assault, and because he had previous offences for theft and possession of cannabis, he spent some time in custody. And this was the first of many spells in custody for Paul. Now, when Paul was 17, he was delighted because he heard that his then girlfriend Amy was pregnant. And Paul was determined to make this work, make his relationship work, and to be the best dad he could be. And he was moving into independent living very soon. And in his head, he had an image of he, Amy, and the baby being happy and having the happy. But unfortunately, that just wasn't to be. Because of their attachment histories and trauma, Paul and Amy's relationship was volatile and it was fraught with conflict. Both Paul and Amy had started using heroin, and they continued to use during her pregnancy. Paul found it really hard to ask for help, but he really tried and he reached out for the sake of the baby. But no matter where he turned, it just seemed that it wasn't possible for him and Amy to get help for their addiction because they had mental health problems that they were waiting for support for. So wee Chloe, their little girl, went to live with foster carers as soon as she was born. Amy and Paul soon split up. Paul found himself again unable to access services because of his criminal record, his volatile behaviour, drug dependency and mental health issues. And he soon found himself living on the streets. And unfortunately for wee Chloe, the cycle continued. So let's turn now to Peter. Let's hear a bit about his story. So Peter's mum was called Brenda, and Brenda also grew up in Belfast in the middle of the Troubles. Brenda's dad was in prison and her mum had an alcohol addiction. Now Brenda was the oldest of 9 children and they had very little money. So Brenda stopped going to school when she was 15 to be around to look after her younger siblings. And when she was 18, Brenda became pregnant by a man that she was seeing who was married. And she was absolutely devastated when she told him she was pregnant. He said he wanted nothing more to do with her. So when Peter was born, Brenda was under a lot of stress because at that stage, she was still living at home. She was trying to look after her siblings, trying to look after her mum, and having a new baby meant that she was under even more financial pressure. And if you asked her what Peter was like, she'd have said he was a really good baby. And she adored him. But even though she adored him, she found the pressure a lot, and sometimes she snapped, she got angry and she shouted at him. So Brenda's Aunt Mary lived up the street and she used to call into the family every day, and she was kind of watching what was going on. And she noticed how Brenda was struggling. And when Peter was 9 months old, Mary offered to look after him until Brenda was able to do so herself. And reluctantly, Brenda realised this might be a good idea, and she agreed. So he went to live with Aunt Mary. Now Brenda went to see him every day, but when Peter was 2, Brenda met a new partner, and this partner said that he really didn't want Peter to live with them. So Peter stayed with Aunt Mary until he was 18. Now again, Peter was a wee baby and his brain and body were developing rapidly. And again, we know that children develop in the context of their environment, and Peter's environment was very stressful. So understandably, this stress impacted his development. Peter was a quiet and shy child, and he struggled to make friends. He spent a lot of time in his room. And Aunt Mary would say that sometimes she didn't know why he just trashed his room and threw things around, and sometimes he even shouted and lashed out at Aunt Mary. When he was 12, Aunt Mary found a bottle of vodka in his bedroom. And when he was 13, she got a call from the school to say that he had turned up at school under the influence of alcohol. And Aunt Mary was at the end of her tether, but every time something like this happened, she sat down to talk to Peter. She told him she loved him and said, "Peter, how can I help you, son?" But he pushed her away. So after the incident with the alcohol in school, Mary went up to visit school and she met his form teacher, who was called Mr. Murphy. And Mr. Murphy told Aunt Mary that he had a really good relationship with Peter and he could see his potential. And he told Mary that he would do whatever he could to make sure that Peter didn't get excluded from school because he was on his way. And Mr. Murphy stuck to his word. So when Peter went back to school, Mr. Murphy supported him and kept encouraging him to go to the school counselling service, which Peter eventually did. And Mr. Murphy and Aunt Mary maintained regular contact on the phone. Now, Peter also went to the local youth club, but he had a really good relationship with one of the youth workers there called Jerry. And Jerry, again, gently and quietly encouraged Peter to join the local football team. And eventually Peter did, because Peter was quite talented and he enjoyed football. So Peter met Ciara at the youth club when he was 15. And because of Peter's trauma and attachment history, he really struggled to trust. And he often accused Ciara of being unfaithful even when she wasn't. By the time he was 16, Peter was drinking quite heavily. Now, Ciara loved and supported Peter, but she put her foot down and said, I'm going to end this relationship if you don't stop drinking so much. And that was a real turning point for Peter. And he did cut down his drinking. And he started to think, maybe I can trust Ciara. Maybe she does love me. And he began to trust their relationship. He kept going to football and he got a coaching qualification, which helped him to help the younger children. And he also became a volunteer at the youth club. And he thought about pursuing a career in youth work. And Ciara and Peter eventually moved in together. After a while, they decided that they wanted to have a baby and they had their son, Joel. Now, Peter and Ciara had talked about this. They were really committed to ensuring that Joel had a stable and a happy life. And Aunt Mary was there in the background supporting them, providing practical help and helping them to overcome any challenges that they inevitably faced as parents. And wee Joel grew up in a nurturing environment surrounded by people who loved him and met his needs. And fortunately for wee Joel, the cycle stopped there. So what was the difference that made the difference for Peter? And what didn't make the difference for Paul? Now, I know this is a webinar, so people can't speak, but no doubt people are shouting. We know resilience, the key to resilience is relationships. So obviously it's about relationships. And you're right, but we're going to delve under the skin of that a wee bit. Because we know that personal relationships matter. But what also matters is how people are treated in their communities and in the wider systems and organizations that they come into contact with. So let's think about that in relation to Peter and Paul. So for Peter, that's Peter on the left, the personal relationships that he had with his Aunt Mary and his mum, even though he didn't live with her, with Ciara, with baby Joel, the messages that he received through those relationships were, you are loved, you matter. Thinking about Paul, well, Paul had nobody. Everybody that he loved either left him or he was taken away from them. So the messages that he got were, you're unlovable. You don't matter. What about community? Well, thinking about Peter, Peter's community provided a network of support. Jerry in the youth club, the football coach, neighbours, friends, and the messages that Peter got from his community were, you belong, you are accepted. What about Paul? Well, what did he get in his community? He got rejection. He was violently assaulted by an adult within his own community. So the messages that he got were, you don't belong here. You are not accepted. Now let's turn to systems and organisations. For Peter, the organisations and systems that he came into contact with, thinking about Mr. Murphy, for example, met his needs and they treated him compassionately. So the messages that he got were, you're deserving. You are a worthwhile human being. For Paul, well, he was met with closed doors, with rejection, and he was treated with disdain. So the messages that he got were, you're undeserving. You are not a worthwhile human being. So Peter had supportive relationships in his personal life, didn't he? And also in his community. And he also experienced what we call SPACE. Love an acronym, we do. Systems that are person-centered, adaptable, compassionate, and empowering. Because the systems and organizations that he came into contact with focused on his needs, and they adapted their services to ensure that they met his needs. They were caring, they were compassionate, they were empowering, they focused on his strengths and his capabilities, and basically they supported him to achieve his potential. Now, it's important to say that for Peter, it just wasn't one smile, it wasn't one hug or one touch that made the difference. It was tiny moments and micro moments of care and compassion, day after day, month after month, and year after year, that helped him stop the intergenerational cycle of trauma. So what about Paul? Well, Paul not only had no supportive personal relationships, but he was also shunned and mistreated within his community. He had what we call DACEs, dehumanizing adverse system experiences. In fact, most of his experiences with others were dehumanizing. It's a big word, isn't it? Dehumanizing. Why do we use that word? Well, Paul was consistently met with nothing but rejection, exclusion, disdain, and disgust. And he heard things like, sorry, we can't help you. You don't meet the criteria. You need to have an address. You need to be clean. Come back next week. There's a waiting list. Or you missed an appointment, so you're off the list. Now, Paul's early trauma and attachment experiences had left him with a deep, visceral sense of being flawed and a horrible person. And this self-disgust was reinforced consistently throughout his life, through the connection that he missed in his personal relationships, community rejection, and through basically all the interactions that he had with organizations and systems. And again, it wasn't one single event, it wasn't one single experience that made Paul feel less than human. It was small moments and micro moments of disdain and disgust, day after day, month after month, year after year. It was those subtle things that Paul noticed more because of that highly sensitive temperament. Things like people turning their nose up at his smell, raising their eyebrows at his presentation, sighing at his desperation, and turning their eyes away from his shame that reinforced this shame and made him feel undeserving and pretty much worthless as a human being. So let's go back to those two little boys sitting on the wall, one called Peter, the other called Paul. Peter had trauma, so had Paul. People saved Peter, but people failed Paul. So that is the end of my presentation. And now I'm assuming, I think now we're going to have an opportunity for anyone that wants to ask any questions or share any comments about Peter and Paul's story. And very often it's a very emotive story, deliberately, and it will raise some questions and some emotions because we are all human and it can be triggering for people. So I'm happy to take any questions. Hopefully there's been some questions coming in, David.
Great, thanks very much, Deirdre. If I can just say, as maybe some questions are coming in, just to say at the moment that that's really helpful. I think it's a really powerful way of conveying all those messages around transgenerational trauma, but through that story mode, through talking about Peter and Paul, it really sort of personalized it, and I think it really did highlight, how relationships matter, and also the importance of a supportive, wider community and organizations and the impact of their approaches. I think really there are a lot of lessons for us all there. As Deirdre says, we're happy to take any questions now. If not, we'll move on. And just to remind you, while we're waiting here, there's a Q&A box there people can put their questions into. And I noticed that Siobhan O'Neill has already answered 2 of them. So if there are any more, please do put them in there. No questions? I can. Oh, there we have a comment there from Karen. Thank you, Karen. I hope you think you see that, Deirdre. Just want to mention how powerful and significant the example was and the lessons we all learned from them. So thank you.
Thank you.
And another comment there from Tracy. Once the damage has been done, how can we help?
I suppose that yeah, it's being aware of the power. I think we underestimate the power of human connection and the simple. We sometimes think there has to be this magical solution. I mean, you heard the story of Peter and Paul, and it was evocative because that was our experience. And the difference that made the difference for a lot of young people was compassion and care. It wasn't necessarily, I mean, Bruce Perry says people, not programs, change people. Programs, I deliver programs and I'm very fond of programs, but the human touch and the stories that I shared there, I know that I have caused harm in my work. I worked in youth justice for many years and I made mistakes because with very well intentioned, but looking back now, and I'm also a human being. And I think just being aware of the power of our humanness, and when someone is hurt, is wounded, because trauma is a Greek word for wound. When someone is wounded, we can support them by that connection. I mean, we know there's a lot of information and that will be shared today about, but I think interventions and just that being consistently, persistently there for an individual can make a huge difference. You're on mute, David.
Thanks, Deirdre. I see also that Siobhan is typing there, so she's going to partly answer that question as well. Look, if you don't mind, the questions in the Q&A are mounting up there. If you don't mind, we'll carry on. And Deirdre, you'll be here at the end, won't you, as well, if necessary, to answer some questions with our other guests as well. So thank you for that. So if we can move on then. So next up, we're delighted to welcome Lorna Aitken, Senior Education Officer at Education Scotland, and her former colleague, Gail Nowek, who's now Principal Psychologist at North Ayrshire Council. And together, they're going to talk about the recent Education Scotland report, Nurture Adverse Childhood Experiences and Trauma-Informed Practice, making the links between these approaches. And it looks at the Scottish education system and its approaches to trauma-informed practice. Understanding how early experiences impact children and young people's behaviour and the importance of relationships in shaping later outcomes is the foundation that underpins much of the Scottish policy landscape and curriculum. Getting it right for every child recognises that children and young people will have different experiences in their lives, but every child and young person has the right to expect appropriate support from adults to grow, develop and reach their full potential. So Lorna will provide some context to the landscape of education in Scotland, and Gail will discuss the nurturing and trauma-informed approaches being taken forward in Scotland with some specific examples in a local authority context. Lorna and Gail, you're both very welcome.
Thank you so much, David. I'm gonna make a start on our presentation this afternoon, and can I just say how transfixed I was in relation to the story of Peter and Paul that's just been shared. It really brings it to life in relation to you know, how we're trying to support children and young people and young adults as well as they move through their own lived experiences as well. So thank you so much for having both myself and Gail this afternoon for your session. As David said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you just a brief overview really of the Scottish context, if you like, in relation to how we got to where we are now in relation to our approach to trauma-informed, being trauma-informed and those trauma-informed approaches. So just a little bit of context in relation to me. I'm a senior education officer and I currently work at Education Scotland, and Education Scotland is the national agency for education within Scotland. and our funding comes from Scottish Government. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you just in this next 15-20 minutes is really just hopefully going to put that into context in relation to our trauma approaches within the education sector, but really paying cognizance to the fact that this is actually sector-wide. This is a multi-agency approach that we're looking at here. So I'm just going to share my slides, hopefully. Bear with me, and I'll just open this up. There we go. That should hopefully be just about sharing with you now. If somebody can just give me a nod to let me know that's sharing.
Yes, all good, Lorna, thank you.
Perfect, that's great. And you know, as we go through, hopefully I'll be able to pick up on some of your questions that are coming through, but please do get in touch after the session today. My details are on the screen, and Gail will also share her details as well. So a little bit of the overview of the kind of Scottish education context. Obviously we have our Scottish Government, and they are the ones who obviously support our policy. They support the writing of guidance in relation to education, health, social work, and also pull the purse strings in relation to anything that we can do taking forward. As I mentioned, Education Scotland is the national agency for education, and we provide that support and challenge for the system-wide in relation to practitioners and anybody working within the school and any settings, or early years CLD settings as well. At the moment, our wee country is broken into 6 regions, and although you can see on the map there is our Highland region is one of the largest, but it certainly is by no means one of the largest in relation to population. So that little purple one in there is actually where the majority of our staffing and our learners are in the West Partnership in there. And within those 6 regions and across the country, we've actually got 32 local authorities, and the local authorities are the ones who really hold the legislative responsibility in relation to delivering education services, and they are the ones who are accountable for their own funding, which is devolved from Scottish Government. So that's just a really little bit of context, because obviously I realise you know, some people might not be aware of the education context in Scotland. But this next few slides, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a bit of a journey, a bit of another story, but a slightly different story in relation to how we got to where we are just now, so that Gail can then pick up from there and talk about some of the work that we're doing currently, and some of the work that's going on within some of the local authorities as well. So what is the Scottish story? And this arrow really, hopefully, a timeline, I guess, it gives an overview of how far we've come in Scotland. So that first one there in the red, our corporal punishment. We had corporal punishment in Scotland, in classrooms in Scotland, right up until 1987. And it was actually 2 parents, it was 2 mums who won an action against within the European Court of Human Rights, and that banned corporal punishment within an education setting. And that really probably was quite a significant moment in time in relation to how we deal with and respond to potentially those children who have been impacted and affected by trauma, because that's effectively what this is. Then we moved into that kind of phase around that authoritarian, that kind of discipline phase, where although we didn't have the corporal punishment, we certainly had a disciplinarian focus in and around how we would deal with situations in and across schools and settings. And then slowly but surely that shift was moving. And I'm going to share with you kind of more details in relation to the timeline for this, into this phase where it was more about behaviour management. It was about managing those behaviours in the classroom and using different strategies that were available to us to manage that behaviour. And that was the language that we used during that time. And then over this last few years, there's been a real cultural shift to begin to talk about relational and being relational and trauma informed, and the importance of those relationships, which we've heard about already today, but really just focusing in on the importance of those relationships that everybody and anybody has with children and young people, and the impact that can have on that transgenerational trauma. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail, really probably in and around a little bit of this phase here between the green and the purple, and then certainly go and tell you a little bit of the story between the purple and the blue in there. So hopefully you can see that. I know that the text is probably quite small, but I'll tell the story as I'm going through. So in 2001, goodness, it seems such a long time ago now, there was a report which was published, and it was called For Scotland's Children. And basically that was a significant part in time for all of our, that multi-agency approach. So thinking about education and health and social work and police, and how we are all as one to make sure that we are supporting individual children, supporting the well-being of children and young people. So the report really outlined recommendations for Scottish Government to take forward, really in and around that information sharing, storage of information, that the resource allocation, you know, how we're supporting children and young people, and thinking about the safeguarding of our learners, and well into that kind of child protection space as well, and really just thinking about those review processes, and really just that whole space of how do we tighten this up so that anybody who's involved with that child or young person has an understanding about what that child or young person has been through, without having to go through that process of continually repeating or asking the child or young person, or the family for that matter, to continually repeat the story of their own trauma, and to enable people to be able to support them. The next year, there was also a national debate around Scottish education, and again it was led by Scottish Government, it was led by a different directorate, but there was definitely that feeling of the For Scotland's Children report coming through in that Scottish debate. And the Scottish debate was significant. It involved parents, carers, children, young people, practitioners, all feeding into that national debate, into what should our curriculum look like, what should Scottish education look like. So you can see that there's a little ball starting to roll in this kind of process. Then in 2005, a few years later, a public consultation on the reform of children's services came out. And this was really off the back of the For Scotland's Children report. And it really was a consultation that was saying, how are we going to make this better? How are we going to ensure that all of our services are integrated, that they talk to each other, that we have an understanding about, we're all using the same language, that we're being consistent in our approaches. So this was quite a significant world leading piece of work that was going on in relation to that joint up approach to supporting children and young people in Scotland. And then in 2006, there was a different research that came out, and again this kind of really goes back to that whole arrow that I was sharing with you earlier in relation to where we've come from in relation to the language that has been used. And this was the first ever research in Scotland around the behaviour in Scottish schools. So it took data from across Scotland in relation to what was happening in schools in relation to behaviour. And since 2006, there's been another 4 reports that's been published. So you can actually begin to see some of the trends that's been going on and some of the improvements that's taken place over time in relation to the work that's being put in place within Scotland. And you will get a PDF version of the slides after the presentation, and you'll be able to hopefully click on some of these links and access some of these reports as well. So it's building up a bit of a picture about where we are at. And again, just moving into that next phase. 2008 was the first year that are getting it right for every child. So that's what GIRFEC is. GIRFEC is getting it right for every child. And that's the Scottish approach to making sure that we get the right support at the right time from the right people for our children and young people in Scotland. And that was drawn together from the work from that report, initial report in 2001. And I really wanted to share this timeline with you to demonstrate the significant length of time that it has taken for us to get to where we have got to in Scotland. And that this hasn't happened overnight. We've still got a long way to go in relation to aspects, and we're always still learning, and we're always still building on research, you know, and that evidence and data base that we have to our fingertips. Then in 2008, so as a result of that national debate and that national consultation around Scottish education, we had our curriculum, what we call our Curriculum for Excellence, was published. And our Curriculum for Excellence was quite groundbreaking from the point of view that there was a real shift from what we previously had as our curriculum, which was called 5 to 14, which didn't even incorporate early years, and it didn't incorporate our senior phase. What Curriculum for Excellence did was it took a 3 to 18 approach. And really what it did was place learners at the heart of their learning. So instead of it being a very teacher-led, project-led education, basically what we have now in Scotland at the moment is Curriculum for Excellence, which really considers the attributes of the learners. It takes on board the skills of the learners and builds on the skills of the learners, and really thinks about their knowledge and what their own individual next steps in learning are. It's a really flexible curriculum. It's really coherent to the needs of what is happening locally. So if you're doing something in and around the space of say your local area, you wouldn't have necessarily one topic that's going to cover that for the whole of Scotland, because we've obviously got different demographics, we've got different geographical areas across Scotland. So what you do within your classroom in Highland is going to look very, very different to what that looks like in Glasgow city centre. But as long as you are meeting the experiences and the outcomes and developing the skills of the learner, and that was what was really important. But at the heart of Curriculum for Excellence, and one of the key priorities within Curriculum for Excellence, was one area specifically around health and well-being, and specifically around responsibility of all. And that was really that onus on the well-being and the health and well-being of children and young people in Scotland is not the responsibility of one teacher or one person, such as might be your guidance teacher or pastoral care within a secondary. It is the responsibility of all. So we've still got that significant, that little ball continuing to roll, building traction, keeping going. And then in 2008 as well, we also had health promotion guidance for schools and local authorities, and that also included a kind of health promoting schools focus. And again, that's building on GIRFEC. It's building on all of the work that we've done around that shift from into that kind of behavioural approaches, those relational approaches that we're starting to shift into now. In 2012, so think about that, that's 4 years later after GIRFEC was published. What they did was they updated the guidance that they had published in 2008, and that was based on their Pathfinder results. So the Pathfinder was basically a number of local authorities that kind of piloted this multi-agency approach to supporting children and young people, and having that kind of consistent approach to supporting children and young people. Significantly, we then had legislation come into play in 2014, and that was our Children and Young People Act, which really took on board all of this work around GIRFEC, our child protection policies, that multi-agency approach with our police, health, social work, and anybody else involved in supporting the development of children and young people. And then in 2014, the National Child Protection Guidance was also updated to reflect the work of GIRFEC, and also to take into consideration some of the recommendations or changes in legislation in the Children and Young People Act. And moving on so that we get closer to where we are now. So in 2016, so we're kind of like still moving along in that timeline, there was work within Education Scotland in relation to the work around the behaviour research that was there. There was obviously significant work going on at that time around nurture, around adverse childhood experiences, and beginning to come into play in and around that space of being trauma informed. And there was development which Gail was involved in, which she may allude to when she comes on, in relation to applying nurture as a whole school approach. And that really was that space to embed the whole importance of those relationships, and the importance of understanding that all language is communication. So really thinking about the 6 principles within nurture, and this was a self-evaluation toolkit which was supporting the education workforce to improve those experiences. So thinking about all different levels of supports and well-being supports that children and young people, whether that's a universal level, whether it's low level, you know, it might be small interventions that they're needing, or potentially those children and young people who are needing much more significant interventions to support their well-being and help improve their chances. Then moving on, in 2017, we had the publication of the Scottish Mental Health Strategy, which outlined a number of recommendations, including those within education. But significantly, what that strategy did was it meant that we were also working much more closely with our health colleagues, who obviously had a significant amount of funding in relation to supporting mental health, not just of children and young people, but across the board. But really kind of thinking about that space of that much more joined up approach with our health colleagues. And that then led on to our linking in with NHS Education for Scotland, which is NES, in relation to their National Trauma Training Programme. And this is again just another significant point in the timeline for Scotland in relation to looking at those trauma-informed approaches and thinking about the links across nurture, adverse childhood experiences, and trauma itself. There's been 1.5, I won't say billion, but I think it's million invested in this National Trauma Training Programme to date. And it is still continually being updated. It's continually being promoted by our NES colleagues, and certainly within education, it's something that we use regularly to support the professional learning for practitioners. Then moving into 2019, we had a significant document published by Scottish Government in relation to developing a positive whole school ethos and culture, relationships, learning, and notice the word behaviour is right at the end. So it's all about the whole school ethos first, the culture, the relationships, the learning, and then the behaviour. So it's really that whole space and kind of emphasising the importance of those relationships, the culture shift, you know, the fact that it's the whole school, the community, it's not just people working in the schools, everybody involved in supporting those children and young people. So another significant piece there. And then we also had in 2019 the Compassionate Connected Communities Professional Learning, which really built on the NTTP, the National Trauma Training Programme from NES colleagues. And this was a specific professional learning programme for education colleagues. So really supporting our practitioners with practical advice, practical supports that they can use in their classrooms, in their settings, to support children and young people who have been specifically impacted by trauma. And Gail might touch on that as well. And I promise, Gail, I'm nearly finished. I'll pass over to you in just a second. To finish off to roughly where we're at just now, so that we've got that kind of final context in place. 2021, so just last year, we had our National Child Protection Guidance were updated, and that was to reflect a shift in and around the space of basically rights-based approaches for children and young people. So thinking about UNCRC and that whole space of having the child and the learner at the centre of everything that we do. So our guidance has been updated. So that was 7 years after it had been published. So obviously there were some significant changes there. And then just very recently, we had our Getting It Right for Every Child policy and practice published and updated and published again and again, really just paying cognizance to the fact that we now have rights-based approaches, that we are making sure that we've got that child at the centre, and also just a tightening up really of some of those connections. So what we've learned since 2008, since GIRFEC was initially published, and really kind of that whole review of where we've got to in relation to policy and practice and what that looks like. So a significant update in relation to that work there. So there's just a real rollout of that work going on just now in Scotland. Interestingly enough, we are now going into, or we've just completed a public consultation, a national discussion on the reform of Scottish education again. So that cycle, that ball that's kept on rolling has come full circle again. And we're looking at that reform and you know, did we get it right with Curriculum for Excellence? What did work well? And what can we improve on? And certainly I will be banging a very large drum in relation to making sure that the well-being and the health and well-being of our children and young people is front and centre of our whatever our new curriculum is going to look like. We also this year had another consultation on another mental health strategy, and that's really off the back of COVID and some of the significant changes that's taken place during that time. And then looking ahead, next year, it's looking like we potentially in Scotland might have UNCRC, the rights of the child, enshrined in Scots law. So although you know we very much have rights-based approaches embedded in our you know, our policy and our practice, but actually having it enshrined in Scots law potentially from next year is going to be a significant change in relation to supporting the well-being and the health and well-being of our children and young people in Scotland. So hopefully that little journey gives you an overview of where we're at, how we got to where we've got to just now. And I'm going to hand over to Gail just now, who's going to give you an overview of the paper that she supported the development of and some of the work that's going on in her local authority. So thanks very much. I'll stop sharing and I'll pass over to Gail.
Hello all, and thank you so much, Lorna, for setting that context, and also thank you to our host for inviting us along to talk today. As I was introduced, I obviously now work in a local authority as a principal educational psychologist, but did spend around 4 or 5 years within Education Scotland in the same team that Lorna's in. So that was really interesting, and it's really helpful to be back in a local authority and take some of that work forward. So hopefully I can capture some of the national kind of developments around trauma and ACEs and nurture, but also share a wee bit of my local authority context with you, which will hopefully be of interest. Hopefully I'll be able to share my screen okay. I do have a tiny little video at the end, so hopefully I'll tip my share sound and share my presentation with you. And just do it from the beginning, and hopefully that'll work. Is that okay? Can somebody just let me know that that's sharing okay?
It's perfect, Gail, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'm really excited and have really enjoyed the previous speakers talking about the transgenerational trauma, because I think we have lots of really good work in Scotland, but lots to learn about your real focus on transgenerational trauma. It's not something that we've specifically focused on. And when I think about our communities in Scotland in terms of ongoing poverty and some of our substance misuse figures and some of the trauma that is endemic in our communities, I really think that there's a lot of application in this. So hopefully I'll thread some of that through my presentation as well, but I've found it really helpful to hear some of the speakers so far. So I'm going to talk a wee bit. I like to put my aims out really to keep me right more than anything, just to help me to focus on what am I actually speaking about, and I don't slightly diverge from my topic. So I'm going to talk about those three kind of approaches that we mentioned: the trauma, the ACEs approach, and nurture, which is a huge thing in Scotland. But I also know that there are nurture groups within Northern Ireland, so you'll have some experience of that as well, potentially in education. But really thinking about the links based on that paper that obviously we were asked to speak about, and how those links are really crucial, because we don't want to keep reinventing the wheel, but also what are some of the challenges in taking that forward, and some of the approaches that we have applied in a local authority context. So you saw that wee arrow that Lorna was talking about in terms of our journey. We obviously, that's a vision for us, but I would say that we are quite far on along that journey in terms of that vision. So we talk about a relational approach. We don't always talk about nurture, trauma-informed, ACEs informed. We talk in Scottish education really about this relational approach. And what we mean by that is, as Lorna said, it's rights-based, it is trauma-informed, it's nurturing, it's inclusive, and it understands the impact of early adversity. But that focus, as Lorna also highlighted, on well-being as well as attainment. And there's a wee quote there to the right from one of those papers that Lorna shared with you. I'll just let you have a wee look at that for a second. Okay. So the paper that I'm about to say a bit more about was written before the pandemic. And I think that a lot of our training materials, a lot of our coaching and things that we're doing within education and across multi-agency are obviously now really picking up on the impact of the pandemic as well. And I think it's really important to highlight that this work was pre-pandemic, but it has actually become even more crucial. And most of you, or many of you potentially, will have seen the kind of Twitter sharing of the fact that during the pandemic, we were all in the same storm, riding the crazy waves, but we weren't all in the same boat. So a lot of us did have the resilience, the tools, the supports, the things that we needed to get through that pandemic, even though it might have had an adverse effect on us. But a lot of our children and young people, some of our staff, some of our families didn't have that support. Some of them thrived in it to some extent. We did have a lot of our young people who quite enjoyed not having the pressures of coming to school and found that helpful. But others really did find it difficult. So what it's led to within education, but also across our communities, is the rising concerns that we've already heard about mental health, increased poverty and stressors in families, lower resilience quite often. We talk about that, particularly in our schools. I think that, you know, we're sort of third year into all these innovations and trying to keep things going, keep juggling the plates and the balls. And I think it's really had an impact on us. So I think in a way that's leading to a transgenerational kind of trauma that we'll continue to see the impact of for generations to come. So there's this need really to think about these nurturing, trauma-informed and ACEs approaches that we had already started to kind of embed. And I hope I'm not teaching my granny to suck eggs too much by talking a bit about nurture. I know that it is a focus, as I say, within your own education system, but I guess it might be useful to hear a wee bit about how we've applied it. So in Scotland, we really do think about it as a universal and a targeted approach. So it is about nurture groups, but it's about that whole school approach as well. And the focus is obviously on the principles of nurture, and the document that Lorna spoke about, applying nurture as a whole school approach, that I was involved in developing, is a framework to really help schools to think about their self-evaluation. Self-evaluation is king in Scotland, and we're always asking our educators to look at within themselves, to look out with them to see how well are we doing, and that's a kind of framework that helps to do that, that can be accessed via Google, in fact, if you want to have a look at it. But that focus within that is about positive relationships. We've heard so much about today, and we've heard also about attachment theory. Nurture is based on the theory of attachment and the really important idea of recreating missed early opportunities, so that when somebody doesn't have that secure attachment, that we're trying to recreate that either within a nurture group, or as we're increasingly trying to do within the wider context of the school as well. But also this focus on care and challenge, that's not just about the kind of warmth and attunement, but in fact, that's my next slide. So instead of just talking about it, I'll show you what I mean. We talk about the 2 pillars of nurture. One of the kind of misconceptions, I guess, about nurture and trauma, and I'm sure you hear this in your own context, is that nurturing and trauma-informed approaches are going easy on children and young people. They let them away with things. It's not doing the old discipline methods that we used to, so that's no wonder children are misbehaving and kind of doing all these crazy things. And I guess it's missing the point of these approaches in our opinion, which is that, you know, because it's recreating early development and those kind of secure attachments, it's about the care, it's about the attunement, the warmth, the connection, the empathy, but it is also about the structure, the expectations, the growth, helping to develop children's sort of stress response system, as we heard about earlier from Siobhan. So I think that that's the bit that we really try to get over to both our educators, but also, you know, our colleagues in health and social care and beyond, to really think about those 2-pronged approaches. And by that, when we're talking about it within a school context, I'm not going to go over all the nurture principles because you'll possibly have come across those before, but I guess we are trying to say to the adults, you know, it is about being reliable, about that connectedness. And we do get challenged about that because people are busy, you know, they have lots of young people to support. They are obviously juggling lots of different kind of expectations, but there are still ways of that mind-mindedness that again Siobhan mentioned about keeping in mind young people and letting them know. So that framework we spoke about is about saying, well, even a welcome, you know, and you'll have seen videos about that on YouTube and stuff about, you know, the way teachers high five and stuff. I have to say that doesn't always go down well in the Scottish context. We're not quite kind of, you know, as sort of emotionally kind of ready to do some of the high fives and stuff, but just even welcoming and saying hi and welcome and it's nice to see you today, I know you're looking well, and things like that. So we're trying to help adults to see that there are small ways to really do that nurturing approach and to respond sensitively and be that secure base for our young people and have those predictable, consistent routines and interactions. Particularly during the pandemic, we saw that a lot of the routines and interactions and the things that they were used to were obviously all up in the air. So it's been really important to really come back and think about how we do that within our schools. And sometimes people, you know, I've heard in the past, you know, some of the kind of wider agencies will, you know, maybe education shouldn't be the focus just now because there's too many other things. But sometimes education is a lifeline for our young people. So we really emphasise that predictability, that consistency, because it helps young people where some of the community stuff, some of the family stuff might be chaotic and difficult for them. And the modelling bit, we heard about that also earlier, you know, for Peter and Paul, and the modelling and the relationships and stuff, and the importance of the adults in doing that and recreating those experiences for them. So within that framework, we have that visual about some of the things that are important about nurture and why that's really helpful in overcoming that early adversity and those kind of trauma-based experiences. So I've mentioned some of those already, but one of the things that's particularly important within nurture is about the nurture principles is about being language focused, you know, using emotional language, you know, helping young people to learn the emotional language so that they can share what's difficult for them and what's challenging rather than expressing that through their behaviours, and also being developmental, because we quite often in education just treat young people as their chronological age, and obviously Lorna mentioned the curriculum for excellence helps us to maybe not do that as much, but also saying, you know, they might be socially and emotionally at age 3 or 4, but they're curriculum wise or in terms of chronology, they're 12. So we need to think about how do we get that right developmentally for our young people, and that's a real focus of our nurturing approach. And again, this has been mentioned because we talked a wee bit about attachment, but I guess not having to revisit the whole of attachment, but our young people do develop these internal working models. And again, we saw that when we were talking about Peter and Paul, so I'm not going to really labour this, but they'll see adults that they interact with as not being trustworthy, not being people that they can rely on if they've had those adverse early experiences and they've had that insecure attachment. And the world is scary, it's dangerous. So quite often you have to revisit and be really determined. I mean, the 6 nurture principles are really important, but we also emphasise that maybe the 7th one should be about persistence and trying to keep going, because you will be rejected multiple times by young people who have had really adverse experiences. And sometimes it's maybe that 10th, 11th, 12th time that you've made that approach and that positive interaction, that you get some kind of positive response, and trying to kind of reverse some of that kind of plasticity of the brain. And I think that's where neuroscience has really helped us with that this is not set, that it's not a done deal, that we can keep revisiting that kind of neurodevelopmental aspect of young people. So our evolution, which Lorna's talked about in terms of policy and our approaches and stuff, but I quite like this idea of this triangle. So we did, borrow from London Borough and Marjorie Boxhall's model of nurture groups within Scotland and Glasgow, which is, we quite often win leaderboards for being one of the most deprived cities in Europe and that type of thing. And that's not necessarily where we want to be. It is also a very thriving and dynamic city. For those of you who have visited, I'm sure you know that. But there is lots of deprivation. So I worked as a psychologist in Glasgow for many years before I went to Education Scotland, and it was one of the first local authorities to introduce the nurture groups and to build that evidence base, because it was a lot of cost that we had to invest in that to really kind of recreate those experiences for our young people. And we found that it did have an evidence base and it did improve wellbeing, but it also improved attainment for our young people. But obviously, as I say, the cost of that and the kind of investment in that is high. So we have to think about, and it's only a select number of young people. And quite often we're finding more and more young people that can't necessarily always be having those kind of targeted approaches. And it is only for 1 session or 2 sessions that's supposed to happen. So we really try to kind of recreate that throughout the school and make those relational approaches apply everywhere you went, and leading up to that idea of whole school nurture and really trying to kind of embed that within systems. And we did a wee study in 2018 that I did with a colleague where we looked across Scotland at local authorities. This was when I was still in Education Scotland, and 27 of our 32 local authorities responded. And 24 of them did have some form of nurture group, so they were still taking that forward, but they were also taking nurturing approaches throughout the whole school forward as well. And the 20 of the 27 also said it was a priority for them. So it is something that's embedded. And I guess the reason I'm telling you that is because when we started talking more about ACEs and trauma-informed approaches, we didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, okay, this is the new approach, let's do that, because trauma-informed approaches really do build on the stuff that we've been doing in education for a wee while around nurture. And we did have an evidence base around that, as I've mentioned. The nurture group research was really robust, but also we borrowed from other research that was going on about authoritative schools, which was more kind of happening in America, but that was the same idea about, having high levels of relational warmth, but also expectations, and trying to have that kind of combined approach, but also hearing about the research around, the key aspect of educators being attachment figures for young people, and being able to kind of mitigate against some of those early experiences by doing that. I don't know if any of you have seen the little YouTube clip of Ian Wright, the footballer, and he gets to go back and meet one of his teachers and the profound impact that person had on him. And we like to remind, that kind of every child deserves a champion, which is also a nice YouTube clip that really reinforces the importance of those relationships and the links with health and wellbeing and attainment, not just in terms of wellbeing. So going on to our journey around ACEs, and you've mentioned this already, so I'm sure many of you are already aware of ACEs, so I'm not going to say too much about it, but I suppose in terms of Scotland's journey, what happened for us was when the film on ACEs, The Resilience, the Biology of Stress, when it was kind of released in 2016, I think it was, 2017. Little known fact that I always like is that it was Robert Redford's son that directed that. And I think that that was a film that really kind of reignited the conversation in Scotland, and people were really, really excited by that and that messaging. And I don't know if the same thing happened in Northern Ireland. I'm sure there was some talk about it there as well. And what we found was, even though this study was done in between 95 and 97 in sort of Kaiser Medical Centre, it really did kind of resonate, I think, within Scotland as to the impact that these early adverse childhood experiences had. And there was a study done in England and Wales that kind of reinforced that. And you'll be aware of the 10 original ACEs, but the big message was that ACEs are common and that at least 2/3 of adults had experienced one or more in this population. And that was replicated to some extent in England and Wales. We since have done a study in 2019 that was released in Scotland, where we found that around 1 in 7 of our population had 4 or more ACEs, which is a high number. So we need to really look at that. But what we also wanted to highlight was, it's not just those original ACEs, which was, you know, about kind of abuse and neglect and all of those things that they had highlighted. But there are all these other adverse experiences that we need to be taking account of. And we've heard a wee bit about community violence being, you know, one of them being prevalent in some of your context. And that's a thing that's also been prevalent in some of our communities for different reasons, but still being an issue for ourselves. And also things like, you know, bereavement, poor academic performance, poverty, bullying, all of those being adverse experiences that people can experience and have long-lasting, profound impacts on them. And again, you may well have seen this, and I suppose what that's really highlighting is that these adverse experiences then go on to disrupt neurodevelopment, have that impact on the impairment of social and emotional and cognitive impairment, and then lead to health kind of risk behaviours, things like, you know, substance misuse and alcohol misuse and all of those things, and then disease and social kind of problems that are part of that, and then early death. When I first saw this, I did think, oh my goodness, you know, that's a very stark message, but I suppose it's an important message. But we also then go on to highlight that these are not totally, you know, it's a fatalistic view, but these are not predetermined, and we can, if we get it right in terms of nurture, trauma-informed approaches, reverse some of that and mitigate against some of it. And that's the really important message that we try to share with our school and wider agency colleagues. And we use some of the Welsh kind of research into this, because, you know, they had similar kind of approaches that they were taking around ACEs, and they had published this report, Sources of Resilience and Their Moderating Relationship with Harm from Adverse Childhood Experiences. And although we do find that those who have ACEs, you know, are much more likely to suffer from mental health issues, there are lots of factors that can mitigate against this. And the next 2 slides kind of demonstrate some of that. So even if you have lots and lots of ACEs, if you have some of these resilience factors, it can sort of tip that balance in your favour, and help that to not become a predetermined thing. And some of the things that they had asked about within that report to some of their population were around some of these factors. And we've heard about some of them already. You know, if you have an available adult, and that can be your early attachment adult, but that can also be replicated as you go through life, either in school, in community learning and development, even into adulthood. If you have somebody who can reverse some of that, that can be really important, because obviously all the time we're hearing about the plasticity of the brain and the neuroscience around that and how that can be reversed well into adulthood. But also things like cultural and community connections. They look specifically at sporting opportunities, and that's something we're really aware of within our local authority. You know, having those community opportunities to get involved in sport, because that again can mitigate against it, but also that cultural connection, that you feel part of your community, you feel proud, you know, either of your nationality or of your heritage, whatever that might be, your religious background, whatever it is that helps you to feel connected to that wider community can mitigate against some of that. But also the skills that help you to manage those emotions, and a lot of them do come through those kind of adult secure relationships that you have, but helping you to regulate those emotions so that you can overcome some of that, and you believe that you can overcome some of this adversity. So moving on a wee bit to how we link that to our trauma-informed approaches. So the Lorna talked about some of the frameworks, the Transforming Psychological Trauma, which was produced by our health colleagues. And they kind of came up with this visual, I suppose, to try and connect the ACEs and the trauma. And I think that they since have sort of realised that maybe, you know, it's not exactly as it's kind of represented here, but it's a framework to kind of work from. And I guess some events are traumatic, whatever they are, you know, they'll have that long-lasting impact. They don't always have to be traumatic, even if you have had ACEs, because some of it is about those resilience factors you have, but also your experience from the community. And sometimes it's how the community perceive those events as well, and whether they're shaming and whether they feel like something that you should hide, that you should be ashamed of. So a lot of it we've spoken about today, about how the community gets around and supports young people when they've experienced adversity or traumatic events. So they don't necessarily have to have long-lasting traumatic impact, dependent on whether they're mitigated by the community, by the adults in their lives, and by the education system and all of those kind of systems that young people find themselves in. And we quite like this kind of, maybe you've seen some of this in your own kind of training and research. This is borrowed from the Harvard kind of Developing Child Institute, and it really looks at those stressors and what might make them more traumatic. And I suppose little amounts of stress within a kind of supported environment can be positive, because they help us build our stress response system, help us become resilient, so that if we encounter stress later in our lives, we can manage that and stuff. And then there's some stress that's a wee bit more extreme, a wee bit more sort of serious, but it's tolerable because we have those supportive relationships, we have the community support and people who recognise the impact of it and come around to support us. But then sometimes it can become toxic, and that's what can lead to that kind of trauma response where it's prolonged, and it's also without the absence of those protective relationships, and that's when it has that lifelong impact. But also, as we've seen today, that kind of transgenerational impact that goes throughout generations. So in our trauma informed kind of approaches, our toolkit and our frameworks, we use the kind of principles of trauma-informed practice, but also those assumptions about trauma. And that's a kind of diagram that's taken from the trauma training kind of framework. And one of the visions that we have around that is that we want a Scotland where people are not blamed or punished for their adverse experiences, which are beyond their control, but where they're not made to feel shame or stigma for the trauma they have suffered through their behaviour or whatever else. So we're trying to build a workforce, particularly within the public sector, that are trauma informed, and that our practices, you know, whether we're teachers, whether we're somebody working in a reception area, in a dentist surgery or wherever, that we are trauma informed, and that our approach is not reinforcing that kind of traumatized or re-traumatizing young people or adults, but is being more understanding and recognising the prevalence and impact of trauma, and actually behaving as though everybody that we might come into contact is potentially carrying some of that. We know that not everyone is, but there is that potential there. So we need to bring that trauma-informed lens and focus to everyone that we meet. And that's just reinforcing that, you know, that assumption that it is common, that we recognise those signs, that when people are dysregulated and becoming upset, not able to kind of, you know, regulate within the classroom, or the parent who becomes really kind of, you know, challenging and stuff, that those are people who might be experiencing aspects of trauma, and that relationships are key within that. And those principles at the bottom, I think, which kind of also really link in with some of those principles we heard earlier in the SPACE acronym, I think, about the choice, the collaboration, the safe environments, that people feel safe within these environments, because our public sector is where we hopefully can have safe places for these people to come and be supported, particularly within education and health and social care and all of those areas, and that you can have trusting relationships with the people within those sectors. And within that framework, we're talking about people not just being trauma informed, but having trauma skilled practice, trauma enhanced practice, and trauma specialist practice. But obviously those layers go up the more you work with young people or adults who have experienced trauma. So we would expect our whole workforce to be trauma informed, but we might expect people like myself to be more trauma skilled, more trauma enhanced, and then really specialist kind of services such as our CAM services and stuff to be specialised in understanding the impact of trauma. And we know about the impact of it. I'm just looking at my time here and making sure I don't go too far over. I've only got probably about 5 minutes or so left. We know about the impact of trauma and how it can continue to be reinforced through generations. So I'll just flash that up there because I do want to move on and say a wee bit for the last 5 minutes about local authority. You've heard about the transgenerational, and I know that we've covered some of that, but just to link it, that this is not just at that lifetime level, but can go on throughout families because of parents' experiences. And talking about how we support that, I suppose that kind of quote there is saying education in particular in a really good position to support that, because we're a universal service who are in front of young people all the time and can help them through those nurturing and relational approaches with the families and their young people to really help mitigate against that. So it's really important that we get all those links, that we don't just see nurture as being education and trauma as being health and ACEs as being public health, but those things are linked up and we work together, because they all share those messages about poor outcomes not being predetermined, but it is important to understand the impact of early adversity and that we can mitigate against it. And it uses research and evidence to inform it, but relationships are the key to buffering some of the negative impact of that, and that awareness and understanding that we develop in our workforce. And those are some of the benefits of it. I'm not going to go into those in detail just now, but as Lorna said, we will share those slides because I'm aware of time. But it's that lens of not just what is wrong with the child, but what has happened to the child and how can we help them. So not just looking for labels. And within our own local authority, we have taken this promoting positive relationships approach, and that's a wee visual that we use. That's the umbrella term. And within that, we're looking at nurture, we're looking at our mental health and wellbeing whole school approaches. And we are really trying to embed the whole school nurture. We've been doing nurture for a while in North Ayrshire, but we're trying to evaluate it. Are we making a difference? Are we using the language of nurture? So instead of challenging behaviour, we talk about distress behaviour. We still have our targeted nurture. We're also looking at anxiety management within our authority, especially emotionally based school avoidance anxiety. We're building on our positive relationships and trying to really reinforce the sort of 2 pillars. So not just, the support bit, but also the challenge bit. We also have restorative approaches, which we have within that. And we're also focusing on our staff wellbeing, because we recognise that staff wellbeing is key to getting all of this right. And that's just a wee example of some of the things that are within our positive relationships approach, and a wee kind of leaflet that we share with our parents and carers. And some of the approaches that we do take to take this forward, some of you might have heard of Dan Hughes' PACE approach, which is about playful acceptance, curiosity and empathy, and really trying to be that empathic adult for both our children and wider families, but also things like the compassionate and connected classroom and community, which Lorna mentioned, which is an approach to recognising trauma for our staff and for our young people. And we have had impact. We do measure our impact, particularly around our nurture groups, but we also are measuring our impact for our young people throughout schools to really measure that we are being trauma informed. And we do challenge our schools and say, well, have you done everything in your power to try and support them? But we're also increasingly working with the wider agency, as Lorna spoke about. So we've done nurture and trauma-informed training within our children's houses to try and help them to support our young people that are, the most vulnerable. We're doing parenting workshops, and we're doing our building on positive relationships to really work with their health and social care partners to deliver parenting. Because although we can recreate those experiences in education, if we get it right for our parents and families and support them, then it helps to kind of really get that early intervention in place as well. And the promise, which is Scotland's approach to care experience young people, is a big focus of our work as well. And I've mentioned video interaction guidance, which is one example of one of the approaches that we're taking as well. So just really to finish up, I might try and show this wee video, which is really, I suppose, demonstrates that this is not inevitable. And I know that we've got time for questions at the end, but I'll just finish up with this wee video to just help to reinforce that message, hopefully. Oops, I lost the wee arrow.
I'm going to end up in prison too, just because my dad's there. You're wrong if you think there are other possibilities for me. I know a criminal breeds a criminal. It's not true. There's good in everyone. My dad's a bad person. Don't think that it could be different for me. That's where I'm going. Doing well at school, finding a good job, that's not important to me. Being in a gang, getting into fights is what matters. Listening to me, you should just write me off. And don't ever believe I want to succeed. I've dropped out. I'm out of reach. Don't assume that I can become anything. You see, the script of my life has already been written. Don't dare to say there's still hope for me. If things were done differently, there could be potential. It's over. Unless you reverse your thinking, totally turn around how you see me, and don't believe it's over. There could be potential if things were done differently. There's still hope for me. Don't dare to say the script of my life has already been written. You see, I can become anything. Don't assume that I've dropped out. I'm out of reach. I want to succeed. And don't ever believe you should just write me off. Listening to me is what matters. Getting into fights, being in a gang, that's not important to me. Finding a good job, doing well at school, that's where I'm going. It could be different for me. Don't think that my dad's a bad person. There's good in everyone. It's not true a criminal breeds a criminal. I know there are other possibilities for me. You're wrong if you think just because my dad's there, I'm going to end up in prison too.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to stop sharing there, hopefully, unless somebody can stop me. I'll hopefully be able to share these slides as well. So anything that I've missed, we can obviously take that from the slides. Thank you.
Goodness, thank you so much, Gail, and also to Lorna. Goodness me, we've got a lot of food for thought there. Thank you so much. I think Lorna, going right back to the 1980s and hearing how Scotland's been supporting children and young people in education is a really impressive journey. I know it's still continuing, but clearly has taken a lot of commitment, prioritisation, of course, investment, but very impressive. And I think a lot for us to learn there. And Gail, thank you so much. There's a lot of learning there for us in Northern Ireland as well. A very holistic approach, putting children at the centre of any developments, and really impressive hearing about Scotland's approach to ACEs. Good comparison for us to think about how we're doing things here and your trauma-informed approaches. Again, investment required to make it happen. And I'm delighted to hear, actually, looking at the responses there, and Siobhan's mentioned in the Q&A that we've got good, strong relationships with yourselves in Scotland as well, because as I say, I think we've got a lot to learn there. So I could now ask all the speakers to put the cameras back on. That'd be helpful. I know Siobhan's there as well, and Deirdre. That's great, thank you. We'll go for the Q&A. And I think we can see there in the Q&A that, goodness me, there have been a lot of questions that have been answered. 15 have been answered. Thanks, Siobhan. Goodness me, you've been a bit of speed typing there. Very lengthy. Thank you so much. And Deirdre and Lorna as well. I'm just clicking through them. Thanks so much for that. There are 5 open questions there as well. And they're not all actually questions. There are 2, one from Joy, one from Amanda, yes, one from Joy, one from Amanda, really. I also encourage the audience as well, if there are any other questions you want to add, now is your time. We're happy to take them as you wish. So firstly, just looking at, if you're able, speakers, to look at the questions that are there. There's one from Joy about during the independent care review, and there's one then from Amanda about positive outcomes, the nurture approaches across education. I think the Amanda Jones question is all about Scotland and in comparisons there. And would Lorna or Gail want to touch on that one? Is that? Yep, so how are outcomes being identified, or when do you expect to see the long-term benefits? It's probably Gail, I suspect. Probably.
Yeah,
yeah.
I don't mind, yeah. I mean, I guess in terms of exclusions, people are always very surprised by how low our exclusions are. So our exclusions are certainly really, really low within Scotland. But I guess in terms of the impact, obviously because I'm in a local authority, I do see the language and how people support young people. I used to feel as a psychologist that I would be the person reframing how people see young people and talking about their early experiences and talking about, well, we've got to be more. And actually, sometimes, well, quite often at meetings, I feel quite redundant because I think it is the language of how we speak about young people in Scotland now. So we do talk about them being distressed. We do. It's not totally consistent across the board. And sometimes I worry that, you know, there's a bit of internal exclusion, if that makes sense, that, you know, we keep young people, we don't exclude them, but, you know, we are maybe, you know, they're sitting outside the head teacher's office or we're doing things like that, but we certainly are trying to keep them within an education context. And I think our figures and our statistics show that we are successfully doing that, and we are supporting their well-being. But we still need that consistency. But I certainly think the way that our educators approach young people, that we do see a big impact on their well-being. I think the pandemic has taken us back a little bit because our resilience has been impacted upon, and it's been a tough year. It's really tough in education just now, and I don't think I would be being honest if I didn't say that people are finding it really tricky. But there's that still that resilience and persistence that people are still working together collaboratively with their colleagues in health and health and social care to try and really support our young people. And I think there's a real vision and a willingness to do that. So I do think that we have been successful to a large extent, but we've been a wee bit wobbled by the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Like so much, we're sort of taking a bit of a step back in some cases, or treading water because of the pandemic. Any other comments then on that? And is there any comparisons with any from Northern Ireland in terms of our approach? I don't know if Siobhan, have you got any thoughts in terms of how we are approaching things and what we have to learn from the approach from Scotland?
I know there are links with Scotland. We have the framework, we have the mental health strategy, both. When you talk about trauma-informed practice, they say that it's not something that you need to write all over a strategy. It should just be apparent when you read it that that's what it is, and that's the attitude. There was a working group to progress this. It stalled a bit as a result of the pandemic, I think, but I'm working to try and resurrect that. And Tara's put in some training programs there in the chat as well. I think the lack of a budget for these things is going to be a problem, and then we would need an executive to release a budget for this sort of thing. So that's difficult, but we have some good strategies and policies there, but we're certainly at an earlier stage than Scotland, but we know where we need to go, and this is a really hopeful conversation, I think, too.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and just checking the questions, there's one more there. It was from Joy Fleming during the independent care review, and wondering about the raising the issue of the absolute importance of one person who cared and made a difference, who was sometimes a teacher. Instantly thoughts about how we continue to work together to keep the promise. Would that be Lorna or Gail? Do you want to give any sort of thoughts from Scotland on that?
Yeah, David, I'm happy to come in on that, and I guess it really just builds on what I was saying in relation to that timeline and that space, you know. And although I didn't mention that the promise in that space, it's really that culture shift. You know, we have the promise because of where we have got to in relation to that process that we've gone through. And I think that's really important, because it would be completely disjointed if we weren't in this space where we were using that consistent language that Gail was talking about, where we understand what a trauma-informed and nurturing approaches looks like. And that's across the workforce. That's a multi-agency across the workforce approach to that. So keeping the promise is very much embedded in everything that certainly I do in relation to my work at Education Scotland as part of that wider sphere in relation to supporting inclusion, wellbeing and equalities.
Lovely, thank you. And we've just got probably time for one more question. I see it's there, anonymous. When working with a child who's experiencing ill mental health, but you're struggling to provide them with services due to waiting list times, are there alternatives? How else can you support them until services become available? Clearly, with all the waiting lists, particularly after COVID, pressure on services, long waiting lists, are there any other alternatives? How else can you support them? Any comments on that?
I don't mind commenting from our perspective, but then I'll maybe pass back to my Northern Irish colleagues to say a wee bit about your own context. Certainly in terms of, in Scotland, our legislation is more about needs rather than diagnosis. So I think that I don't think we can do everything in education, but I think that in terms of recognising the barriers and the needs, then we can support them even without them going through mental health services. But I know that there are children at the extreme end that will still need an element of mental health service. But I think that in terms of education, we have counsellors, we have, we do a lot of suicide prevention within our local authority. We have lots of mental health and wellbeing supports. We have things like Liam, which is about anxiety management. Our NEST colleagues have trained us in a lot of that stuff. So there's lots of things that we are doing, but I absolutely recognise and want to undermine the kind of feeling of being a parent or a young person waiting for mental health services, because I absolutely recognise that that's stressful. But I don't want people to feel that nothing is going on during that time that they're waiting, because there's lots and lots of services that do come together and approaches that we take to support mental health within local authorities.
Okay, thank you. And I see there we had some responses as well to that question in the Q&A as well. Controlled School Support Council do great work with trauma-informed practice, and then Take 5 approach and solid health training is super. Siobhan, do you want to add something from the local perspective?
Yeah, to that last question, I've been reflecting on the waiting lists are a real problem here, but we're starting now to have CAMS teams in schools where there'll be mental health professionals in schools actually who can do that kind of triage work and who will be able to provide more specific guidance for individual young people depending on what their needs are. But if it's from a parenting perspective, I think there's lots of parenting webinars and resources there that can help with that therapeutic parenting approach, just to give you that sort of the basics. Even learning about ACEs and the Solihull approach and all of that can be really helpful, just so that you can understand the root of these behaviours. And also I would say trying to, and this can only be done in the family, I suppose, emphasising the physical, making sure the child is getting enough sleep, that they have a safe environment, that they can express themselves, and ramping up the physical activity and the art and the creativity and all of that can be helpful in the meantime. Even keeping a diary of symptoms, so that whenever you get to the top of that waiting list, that you have a good understanding of what the issue is. Those can all be helpful, but the consultation with mental health professionals in schools is going to be really helpful. Also, go to your GP if there's a multidisciplinary team there. A mental health worker might be able to help with groups in the local area, that might help your child. But none of this is a substitute for good mental health services, I have to say, and we need to just continue to work and call for those as well, and the implementation of our mental health strategy, which will bring the system changes that are needed to get things right, so that these waiting lists do go down over the longer term.
Yes, and clearly here locally, we all know that we're going to have a battle with investment as well, and getting that mental health strategy delivered as well. So we're going to be closing very shortly. Sorry, Deirdre, I appreciate you haven't had a word since you've spoken.
Yeah,
Is there anything you would like to add?
I was just going to briefly come in on that, because that's some of the work that we're doing at the moment. We're working with a group of parents who all have children on the waiting list for CAMS, and I think there is an over-reliance in our communities on professional services, and also a sense of powerlessness in terms of parents, that these people are the experts, they can help my child with their mental health. And I know that in the community that we work in, just providing parents with some basic information about the science, about biology, about the stuff that Siobhan talked about, has been totally empowering, and helping them understand that they're the best person to help their child. Communities, also there's a huge number of resources within communities that are underused, and I'm not taking away from the importance of specialised services, but I think we're over relying on them, and we need to empower our parents and our communities to support, to wrap around. I mean, as they say, it takes a village to raise a child, so we need to kind of support that village.
Thanks very much. Well, look, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone who's watching, I'm afraid we're sort of getting to the end now. I'm going to draw things to a close. I feel like we're sort of building up a head of steam, actually. We probably chat away here and take a few comments from people putting in something in the Q&A, but I'm afraid we're going to have to draw a line under it. Forgive me, I'm going to draw proceedings to a close. So just a last few words. I think it's really important to recognise that transgenerational trauma doesn't happen to everyone. And the goal of today was not only to cause, fear or panic with the wider public or in our communities, but I suppose for those who do experience it, it's important we send out a positive message of hope. And hopefully today you'll all have gained a greater understanding of the approaches which can help address the issue and raise people's hopes that there can be a solution. However, I think the goal of society must be to come together and prevent transmission of trauma from one generation to the next and break the cycle for future generations of children and young people. And hopefully this second TTAD webinar can be a step towards achieving that. So that marks the end of this event for TTAD 22. And as we end, I'd encourage you to spread the word by continuing to use the hashtags I mentioned earlier, hashtag TTAD 22 and hashtag breaking the cycle on social media. They're up there now on the slide. And you can highlight who you are and the great work that you do as well. There are also a number of key resources that the Our Generation team have created on the Our Generation website up there. Alternatively, you can head to the Our Generation Twitter, Instagram or Facebook channels, which can be found there on the slide. The addresses are there. As mentioned before, we'll also be contacting you for some post-event evaluation. Thanks again. We're very indebted to our speakers. Lots of really good information and learning there. And for everyone else joining us for this year's TTAD event, all of you, thank you so much for turning up. And hopefully we'll maybe see you in person for another similar event next year. And finally, just a last thanks to the funders, SCUPB and Peace 4 Funding, which have made all this possible. And it'd be remiss of me not to thank, of course, the Our Generation team and Chris, who's been behind organising today's event. So ladies and gentlemen, all I can do is wish you a very Merry Christmas and stay safe over this festive period. Thank you.